So you've gotten this far in your certification process here with the MCSA, and you may have at this point realized that Microsoft is sort of notorious for creating these sort of miscellaneous objective domains when they tell you the things you need to know. And we'll probably have more of these as we go throughout this series. But this particular nugget is exactly one of those just miscellaneous types of topics. What we're going to go through here are a variety of just little tools that you should be aware of. I would just know what they are. In some cases, they come in quite handy. The Active Directory replication tools I'm going to show you are ridiculously handy for helping you just troubleshoot when stuff just isn't working right. We'll also talk about a couple of edge cases, or at least one edge case here, which is the upgrading of SYSVOL replication to DFSR. If your Active Directory environment is one that was built after, I think it was 2008, so it began its life as a Windows Server 2008 Active Directory, well, you will never need to do this. Because prior to that time, SYSVOL was replicated, the process by which all of our Active Directory stuff got moved around, through a service called the File Replication Services, or FRS. FRS has been around for a long period of time, and FRS was also notorious for kind of not being all that great. Getting rid of FRS was a really great idea because it could cause some pretty substantive problems. It was just not a really good replication solution. Let's just call it that. Well, Microsoft replaced it with this alternative called DFSR, which is a much superior replication solution and doesn't have the same sort of lingering objects problems and other issues that FRS had. The only time at this point that you will ever have to really worry about this is, as I said, if your Active Directory domain started its life in the days before Windows 2008. If it did, and you have not gone through this upgrade process, well, it's possible that you still have FRS as your replication solution. And this will be something that you need to know for reality as well as for the test. I will show you one command that you will run, and then wait, and then run, and then wait, and then run it again in order to complete this SYSVOL replication upgrade. So there are all kinds of articles out there online that go into far, far too much detail about the process of doing this when it's one command with a couple of switches you need to be aware of. We will also in this nugget spend a little bit of time talking about read-only domain controllers. And although this says replication and password policies associated with RODCs, I want to explore a little deeper into just the management topics associated with RODCs. I don't know about. I tend to find that people have been a little overawed with RODCs and perceive them as being solutions in a large number of areas where they're actually not. Microsoft has really one primary use case for a read-only domain controller, and that is your branch office, your remote office, the little tiny offices which all of us have either have now or have worked with in the past, that are so small that your data center in the office is the machine that sits under Fran's desk up in accounting. Well, if you have that situation where you got a couple of machines that are just sitting under somebody's desks, it might be okay for maybe, I don't know, some services. But if you think about your entire domain and all of the different sites that you may have in that domain and all the different domain controllers that may be out there, well, that one little DC that's sitting under that accountant's desk in Phoenix, in a world without RODCs, that domain controller sitting under that desk has access to every username and every password of every user in every site across the entire Active Directory domain. And so in those situations, it's all too easy for someone to come and just rip off this guy, steal him out of the environment, take him home, and now with physical control of that domain controller, they can apply a variety of hacks and loft crack and other cracking tools that are out there to break into the Active Directory database and get every single username and password. So in those situations, in that situation where you got a DC that is not physically secured, that's when you want to use an RODC. And really, that's kind of it. One important point is that if you have a site with an RODC in there, it is generally not a good idea to put a regular DC in the same site because you're kind of invalidating the whole reason for the RODC to exist in the first place. So you kind of put RODCs by themselves in sites. but that's why you have them. Now, as you can imagine, with an RODC, that little tiny site down there is probably a location that you don't have to go to very often and probably don't want to go to whenever you do. And so I want to talk about the administrative activities with RODCs, just simply because there are a couple of things you have to know for making sure that the admin, the local kind of junior admin that happens to be in that site, has the appropriate permissions to accomplish the things they need to, even in situations where there may be a loss of network connectivity. So a couple of things we'll talk about. And then lastly, I've got a couple of, just a kind of a long list here of tools that you should be aware of. These are ones that I've collected over the years and are just a variety of fun little tools that will help you monitor and manage the various replication activities that happen in Active Directory. You know, Active Directory is more than just replicate the SYSVOL around. There's group policy that's got to get moved around. There is a DNS stuff that has to get moved around. There's Active Directory changes that get moved around. There's all kinds of things that have to function perfectly for a distributed Active Directory to do its job. And having the tools to help you understand when that's working and not working is just something that we all should just have at our disposal. So let's start by taking a look at the first topic here, which, if I bring this up again, is the upgrading of SYSVOL replication to DFSR. Now, at this point in your studying, you should recognize that the SYSVOL is the location where a lot of the content of Active Directory gets stored. It's where your group policy objects are. It's where other stuff gets stored. And the file-based content gets replicated around as part of that application, that 80 replication process. And I can get access to it by going to domain name, company.pri/, and then there is my SYSVOL. Right? So in my SYSVOL are going to be subfolders for the domains that exist, and in there will be some scripts and policies, and here are my group policy objects. Now, a long time ago, when we had FRS, I think people that they thought they were being smart, but they ended up creating problems, saw this replication solution and thought, wow, if I start dropping content into here, it'll get sent around to the other domain controllers in my domain. Well, if you did that, FRS was never designed to be able to replicate large amounts of content. And so it's entirely possible that when you go to your SYSVOL location, that you may end up with some weird objects in here with really long hexadecimal names associated with them. If you do, it's a good idea to try to figure out which of these are valid and which aren't, and get rid of them before you attempt this first SYSVOL upgrade process. And I don't want to get into the details of how to accomplish that. The short of it is you change the name, you wait for it to replicate, and if it does replicate, then you know that's a valid object. If it doesn't, then you know it's not. Well, once you recognize that you've got a healthy SYSVOL and you've got healthy replication, the tool that you will use to upgrade SYSVOL replication to DFSR is DFSR MIG, and then there's a whole bunch of switches here that we can use. So DFSR, MIG, and then these switches. And the process is quite simple. There are 4 different states at which the migration can occur. 0, where you haven't started yet. Then prepared, redirected, and eliminated. And if you go online to go and look at the different articles about how to do this, they overwhelm you with a bunch of, in some cases, unnecessary information. Here's the short answer. You start by typing DFSR MIG, and then you want to use the switch here, set global state. And all this means is that when you go set global state, you're going to choose 1, then 2, and then 3 in order, because each one of these states accomplishes a variety of tasks that need to happen in order to prepare for the tasks that occur in the state following. So the first step in the process is to type DFSR MIG set global state equal to 1, and then wait. How long do you wait? You wait until it's done. And how do you find out when it's done? Well, there's another switch in here that's called DFSR MIG get migration state. Now, you're not going to see anything here because I'm already upgraded. I built this on a Windows Server 2012 R2 environment, so there's not much to see. But this get migration state will tell you whether or not you've gotten to the next state or not. I'm telling you this because, as we've already experienced, if I've got a bunch of sites and I've got my delays and my costs dialed up on my sites, it's possible that the replication of this SYSVOL stuff can take an extended period of time. So set it to 1, check it until it says it's ready to go. And once it says, you know what, all the domain controllers have been migrated successfully to the state number 1 prepared, then you know you can move on to the next state. So DFSR MIG set global state 2 or 2. You repeat that for the second process, and you repeat it for the third process, and that ultimately, once you finish the third process or the third step in here, you'll end up with all domain controllers in that global state eliminated, which means that FRS is finally gone. It's then that you can break out the beers or whatever your favorite afternoon beverage of choice is so that you can celebrate the fact that FRS is no longer around, because we all will be happy when that day occurs. So that's the first of the topics. The second topic is, and it's split up in Microsoft's little objective thing here across these 2 RODC topics, but I want to talk really for a minute about the management of RODCs. Okay, we'll talk about replication, we'll talk about the password policies, but I want to wrap all this up into sort of the greater story about what you got to do whenever you build an RODC. So I already told you that we built this environment, and the Phoenix site is the site where I have an RODC installed. And if I take a look here at domain controllers, you'll see this Phoenix DC1 that's set up as a read-only domain controller. A read-only domain controller object here in the ADUC, Active Directory Users and Computers, has a couple extra tabs that you should be aware of. If I just click for properties on here, I can look at the password replication policy tab here to identify which of the users and groups are being brought down, replicated down to this read-only domain controller so that users can use them to authenticate. Now let me draw some bits in here for you for just a second. So let's go back to our domain again, and let's assume I got Denver up here, and Denver's got a DC, and here's my Phoenix site, and here's my RODC. Now remember, an RODC is designed for the use case where this domain controller happens to be sitting under somebody's desk in accounting or wherever. And with it sitting under that desk, I want to minimize the risk profile of somebody potentially stealing this thing. So the types of groups, users, and computers that I want to replicate down to this domain controller are going to be those that are essentially the people that exist in that Phoenix office, right? If there's 5 people that are sitting in that office, I want those 5 people to have their accounts replicated. Allowed RODC password replication. That's what I'm looking for right there. By doing this, if somebody happens to steal this thing, well then instead of every single username and password in the entire forest being compromised or an entire domain being compromised, I've only lost 5 people's usernames and passwords, and that's a much easier fix than having to repassword every single human being in the whole organization. So it is a smart idea for you to just find the ones that are just relevant for that local location, allow them to replicate down their password information, just drop them here in this group. If you have already a global group for the Phoenix people, drop it into this group, and then those users will have their account information brought down. Now, you may be saying, all right, well, how do I know which users actually have their stuff brought down? Well, that's where the Advanced tab comes into play. You see here, these are the accounts whose passwords are stored on this RODC. There's a couple of them in here now. There's the computer account for Phoenix DC, and then there's this user account here as well. And as time goes on, I'll see more and more of these accounts, the ones that have been approved, show up here in this list. I can also see the accounts that have been authenticated to this read-only domain controller as well. And you'll notice that this list is quite a bit larger than the list that we saw earlier, because this is the list of people who have used the RODC in order to do an authentication, but the RODC itself didn't possess the information it needed. So back to my drawing here. There's my domain controller here and my domain controller here. The Greg Shields user object exists in Active Directory, but it is not replicated down to the Phoenix site. So when Greg Shields is sitting in here in Phoenix trying to log in, Greg Shields logs into this machine, and the read-only domain controller says, I don't have his information. So it goes and requests an authentication from the next available domain controller. So the next controller up in the the replication path. What's important to recognize here is that if I end up with an environment where I've got a lot of sites, for example, and I may end up using an environment where I have a lot of sites and maybe a lot of RODCs as well, it's very important that I have a writable domain controller at least one hop away from every RODC. Now, you can make sure this happens by adjusting your sites and services appropriately. You can use what's called a site link bridge in order to kind of allow for more of a single hop, to allow for a double hop. Site link bridges add transitivity to hops across more than one hop. But these are things you have to have happen so that when this Greg Shields user actually attempts to log in this location, that the RODC can go out to some other location in order to identify who this person is and have them authenticated successfully. Now, I will tell you that there is the occasional use case, right? So this is Phoenix again. There is the occasional use case where the network connection from Phoenix to anywhere else happens to drop. And if that happens, if you end up in that situation, it can be a good idea for you to ensure that somebody in that local site has enough of the logon privileges cached locally on that RODC so that they can perform troubleshooting in the case where there's a loss of network connectivity. Now, there's a couple of ways you can accomplish that. One of the ways you can accomplish that is by going to the RODC here, by going to the RODC, and in its local, I think it's local security, in its local security policy, to identify that junior admin or whomever is local in that network as a user who has the privileges, the rights to log on. I can look at that here under local policies and user rights assessment and allow log on locally, right? I might want to put somebody that's local in this list so that in the case where I have a loss of network connectivity, I still have somebody who can log on. Because remember, my account, your account, anybody who's a privileged account should not have their password replicated to this machine. Should not. You want to have a less important person or a fake account given the privileges to log on locally in these situations. You can do this through local security policy. You can accomplish this through group policy as well. So using a group policy to define what these settings should be. You also can, and this is a nifty one here, if I can pull it up. Let me pull up a command prompt. And if you've played around with the ntds util command, which I'm sure you have at this point, the ntds util is kind of the Swiss Army knife for NT directory services. ntds util, and what I'm looking for here is local roles. The local roles context will help you identify what the defined local roles are and also to show their membership here. So it can be useful here, again, just to identify who these people should be, or even to potentially adjust them. You'll notice the one up here that says add account %S1 to local role %S2. So I can add using NTDS local roles. These are some of the management tasks. You got to have that local person with some kind of access. I mean, that way you got somebody who can patch the machine if you need to, or somebody that can log on and force a replicate. I don't know, any of the things that a local person might need to do with a domain controller, since you as a domain admin are not going to be able to get down there. Remember, this is small use case, very small environment. Now, occasionally, you may end up with a situation where you need to just pre-populate the passwords of people that are already down there. Maybe you got a new user, you created the user account, and you just want to pre-populate that password so that it arrives at that local RODC. You can accomplish that here by clicking this box and then putting in the users or the computers that you want to pre-populate down. But again, these are ways in which you can get that information down, but keep it minimized, because keeping it minimized is what's going to protect you should you lose that domain controller. Now, the other thing to be aware of is this item here called denied RODC password replication group. I'm only pointing this out because this behaves in much the same way that NTFS denied permissions happen, in that if you happen to put a person in the denied group, that person will always be denied forever. no matter if they're in an allowed group or not, they will always be denied their replication, their password being replicated down to that RODC. So deny always wins in every case with RODCs. It can be a good idea to throw like your domain admins group here in the policy. In fact, they already are here by default. So your cert publishers, domain admins, domain controllers, all of the high value targets are those that should be in this list. Again, you're trying to protect yourself against somebody stealing that thing because it's going to be a bad day. I will tell you also that there is the ability to identify which users will have the rights to administer this RODC, and that's done here under the Manage By tab. So this is the group that has the ability to manage this RODC, and right now it's set to domain admins. Now, this has to do with replication for RODCs, but like I said, this is kind of a miscellaneous chapter here. And so the last topic I want to talk about in this nugget has to do with the tools that are available to help you monitor and manage the replication in your environment. So we've set it up now. We've got sites and services up. We've got domain controllers that are replicating to each other. But sometimes that replication just doesn't behave in the ways that we want to. Well, what are the tools that are available to us to speed up replication, to accelerate the process? What are the tools that can show us the replication health? What are tools that can validate that the connections, the secure connections, are out there and functioning correctly so that replication can even exist in the first place? I'm going to show you a series of tools that I think you should just know because these are handy anytime you end up with any Active Directory weirdness. They may be test questions, I don't know, but they're awesome tools, and because this kind of troubleshooting doesn't tend to happen that often, it's great to have them in your quiver, because when it does, it can be a nightmare to try to figure out exactly what's going on so deeply under the covers. Let's start with the process of actually accelerating replication. Because replication, if you recall back in sites and services, replication is one of those things it can be dialed down to happen not all that often. If you've got a really latent network link and something goes on that you need to create a new user account, well, maybe you want that user account to get replicated to its correct location a little faster than waiting for your policy to, your replication interval policy to kick. So one of the ways I can accomplish that is by taking a look at the server itself. Remember when we were looking at these servers and we were looking at the automatically generated domain controller to domain controller inbound replication objects here? But one of the things that I didn't show you was that for these inbound replication objects, I can actually right-click on them and choose to replicate now from that inbound link. So if I know that I've made the change on a particular domain controller because I focused Active Directory users and computers on that domain controller, well, I can replicate now to accelerate that replication. I can also accomplish that via the command line if I want to use a nifty little tool here called repadmin. Repadmin has a whole boatload of switches, and you could spend a nice afternoon with a couple cups of coffee going through all the possible switches here. Repadmin is designed to do all kinds of different just enumeration and configuration of replication with Active Directory. But let me show you 4 different uses of repadmin that will come in absolutely in handy as you go about managing replication in your Active Directory environment. Okay, so the 4 I want to show you, number 1 is repadmin and then replicate. That will expose a variety of additional parameters that you can use for invoking replication on an object. So again, lots of text here, but a couple that I want you to see here is, let's start with the example. So this example, repadmin replicate to the destination domain controller, and there's the source domain controller, and here is the LDAP query, so the context that I want to, what do I want to replicate? So if I don't feel like pulling up Active Directory sites and services, I can use this as a mechanism to initiate replication pretty much anywhere to speed things along. I got it actually coming up. So let me pause here because I want to show you some more of this repadmin stuff. But the minimum amount of time that it takes for an object to replicate from one location to the other is something like 15 minutes. So if I'm trying to go from one site to the other, and I want to set up a site link here, I can't set this down to, I think it's any lower than 15 minutes. Yeah, 15 minutes here is the minimum amount of time that I can put for my replication interval. But Our environments definitely move faster than every 15 minutes in today's day and age. And so there's a mechanism called Active Directory change replication that you can lay into place in order to greatly speed up the process of doing replication. And I just kind of want to pitch that because I want to show you that here in just a second. But it's before we get there, I want to finish up some of these rep admin commands and some other things as well. So AD change replication coming up next. A couple more rep admin commands I want to show you because just these are terrifically useful ones. There is the rep admin show REPL command. This is nice because it will show you the health of replication going on between the different machines in your environment. So here are your inbound neighbors. Bam, 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 bam. The last attempt was successful. All right, I have healthy replication. I also can use repadmin to force the knowledge consistency checker, the KCC, to recalculate its inbound topography. So these are, I've set the topography here in sites and services. I've set the rules, and then it determines what the topography is based off of the rules that I configure here in sites and services. Well, I can force it to re-evaluate, to recalculate that topography with repadmin /KCC. So there is it. The consistency check was successful. Awesome. I've done that now. And the last one here, oops, I actually put this in the wrong order. Hold on. Repadmin, and PRP. I was talking earlier about RODCs. Repadmin PRP gives me a text-based view that lets me see for a particular RODC. In this case, it's my Phoenix read-only domain controller, which users have had their passwords brought down. Which users and computers, really. So if I want to see which users and passwords have had their passwords replicated to an RODC, that is the command line mechanism to accomplish it. There's another tool in here called NLTest, which has almost as many different switches available to it. In fact, I would argue perhaps a few more. NLTest is designed as a mechanism, again, for you to identify and test against the functionality of domain controllers and really everything about the domain. And you can spend a lot of time here, but there's a couple of them I just want you to be aware of. The first of which is the NLTest, the test that we ran back when I was sort of screwing up that creation of the trust, the forest trust between company.pri and specialized.net. I'm sorry for that, but like I said, sometimes you want to see when stuff breaks. Well, I showed you that NLTest and then dsgetDC, DENDC1 was a mechanism to use, it's the dsgetDC name method to identify whether or not the domain controller is, and of course now it's failing again. Now why is that? Oh, that's right, because I need to do, if I can do the NLTest, dsgetDC, then domain name, company.pri, there. That's a mechanism where I can see just, am I getting a response from a domain controller? And you can see down here, here are the different flags for what that domain controller advertises itself as being. There's DENDC1, it's the primary domain, the PDC, global catalog, directory services, LDAP, KDC, so on and so forth. So that's one mechanism where I can just, can I actually access domain services or not? A very high level test. I can also use another one of these commands, the NLTest SC_query command, to verify whether or not I've got a secure channel between where I'm at and where I'm going. So NLTest SC_query, and let's try your specialized.net. Specialized.net. Yep, and there, trusted DC name. There we go. Trusted DC connection status. All right, no error. Success. Command completed successfully. So do I have a secure channel to a trusted DC, in this case across the trust? Another useful tool is one called DFS Diag. So after you've already upgraded your replication to DFSR, you can use DFS Diag, and then the test DCs, test sites, and so on switches, test DCs here, to validate whether or not you have successful replication using DFS. Nice tool. It even has color here, so you can see, yes, indeed, everything is running correctly. In every case with these tools, make sure that you're doing them with an elevated command prompt, because I believe in every case here you'll need that elevated command prompt for it to be able to gather the information that it requires. Don't forget also that whenever you take your DNS zones and upgrade them to be Active Directory integrated zones, don't forget too that here with these zones you can actually make a mistake in identifying where the zone should get replicated to. So you can replicate your zone to all DNS servers in the domain, to those in the forest, or to all the domain controllers in the forest if you want. If you want to create directory partitions, you can accomplish that as well. So setting up directory partitions, which is a very, very advanced topic. Even group policy now with, I believe, with Server 2012 has some new functionality built into it so that you can, from within the group policy management console, actually see whether or not you've got a successful replication of group policy objects. Here in group policy management, under domains, here's my domain, and I can see the status of replication for the group policy objects that exist in the SYSVOL. If I take a look here, I have no domain controllers with replication in process and 3 with replication in sync. So yes, my group policy objects are indeed in sync. So again, just a couple of really nifty little tools that will come in handy from time to time to ensure that your replication is working appropriately. Now I want to kind of close out this nugget with one little pro tip that you can implement if you find that the 15 minutes I was teasing about before for minimum replication time between sites is just something that's not going to work for you. So let me come back here, sites and services, and we were talking before about how when I set up these sites and I put the site links in place, I can't set this to anything less than every 15 minutes. Maybe this isn't working for you. Well, there is it's a bit of a hack, but there's a way in which you can actually dial this down to a much smaller amount of time. And it is a hack in part because Microsoft wants to make you have to want to do it so that you don't end up turning it on by accident and potentially fill up your latent WAN connections. This is called change notification. And change notification is, in fact, it's kind of difficult to implement because the only way to do it is through ADSI edit. If you go to ADSI edit, there is a way in which you can dial this down to, let's see, if I open up the, I believe it's the configuration container here, and if I go to here and then here, and I'm looking for here under sites and then intersite transports, and I'm looking for here CN equals IP. So remember how we were creating those IP-based intersite transports before? Well, now I am digging directly into the Active Directory database. Here danger lies. So be very careful what you're doing here because you could make catastrophic changes in doing this. But if I want to dial things down, I can go here to, let's see, the properties of the IP container, and, the properties of the site link object here, and go to the options right here. And if I want to, I can set this options to, I think it's one, use notify. Turning this to use notify turns on this concept of change notification. And change notifications what's going to happen essentially is that changes will propagate to the remote site with the same frequency that they're propagated within the source site. So if you got an account that gets locked out or an account that you disable, that will happen using what's called urgent replication now, which means it will happen much, much faster than waiting for that replication to occur. Only do this if, again, if you have the bandwidth in order to support it. If you're not sure, do it and definitely measure it, because this will, anytime you're making changes to Active Directory, they will automatically go and they won't get queued up for the next replication interval. Change notification here. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about a variety of miscellaneous topics that are associated with Active Directory and SYSVOL replication. As I said, sometimes with these objectives, there's just a bunch of stuff that they have to cram into one objective domain, and this happens to be the one. If you are an environment that is built your Active Directory on top of Windows 2003 or earlier, well, then you may still have an FRS-based replication, and it's a great idea to get it upgraded to DFSR because your family and friends will just love you that much more. We talked a bit about RODCs and the replication tasks and also some of the management tasks associated with RODCs as well, because they're no less important. And then I went through Greg's little quiver of replication tools, command line and otherwise, that will help you for the variety of different Active Directory stuff that you've got to make sure works so that your Active Directory remains healthy. Coming up next, we're going to drift away ever so slightly from Active Directory and start talking about DHCP. Now, you've already implemented a DHCP server. In fact, you probably implemented a couple of them at this point. And when you've done so, you've facilitated the handing out of addresses in your environment. But in doing so, there are still some advanced options that you can configure to add greater security, to add greater availability to DHCP, just to make the entire experience better. And it is those advanced options that we're going to talk about there in that next nugget. I'm going to assume you already know how to install DHCP and add a DHCP scope. We're going to focus in just on the advanced parts of DHCP. That is the topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.